Hello, everybody. This is another Wizards of Ox Live, and we are going to be talking everything around the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet, if you don't know, it's probably the most valuable asset of this group, and your access to it via the TLO oxalates group is just an incredible privilege. And it's the brainchild of Carla Wiersma, who started putting together everything that we knew about oxalate values in the literature around the world. So if you're looking for values, if you're looking for things that are reliable, this is where you want to get it. There have been many different people that have posted different types of lists, but some of them are older, some of them are, not done in the precise way. Some have uncalculated levels that we'll talk about. So we're going to be, sharing all of this information. One of the really important things in this discussion is for you to know that you do need to be a member of the TLO oxalates group to have access to this information, because it's copyrighted. So please do not just download it and copy it and post it somewhere else, because we have agreements with other people that have done and paid for the testing to have it available for you. But if we just start putting it out, as common thing, then that copyright and that work that scientists have done to give us that information, to help us do the diet in the best way possible, will not, it would just be lost. And
Patricia's breaking up a bit here, so I'm going to jump in just in case she's stuck for a bit. Oh, we lost you, Patricia. So I was jumping in here. The biggest thing that's important for all of us as people who make use of the TLO oxalate spreadsheet is exactly what Patricia was talking about with copyright. We want to protect our ability to have access to this information. Some of the data is not copyrighted, but this spreadsheet, because it is a compilation, includes data that we make available without copyright through the TLO oxalates group, but it also contains data which is copyrighted, which belongs to the Vulvar Pain Foundation. And we want to respect that relationship with them, because we have a lot of very good basics that allowed Susan to get started with this whole enterprise that really came from the Vulvar Pain Foundation. So we would ask everyone not to put at risk all of our ability to make use of all this data, and bear with us by just simply becoming a member of the TLO oxalates group. We'll get you into that spreadsheet group. You'll have access to this document. And today's all about letting you know how much value is built in there. And maybe we can give you a little heads up on our next evolution of this document, where we think we can make it even more valuable to people on the TLO oxalates group who are working to use it as a living item while they're managing their diet. So bear with us. We've been hearing that people are having some challenges with it. We've been hearing that people want something that's simpler. I'm kind of hoping that we'll sell you a little bit on what we got and on how we are trying to simplify it for our next generation of it.
Well, could I talk a little bit about the history?
Absolutely. Take it away, Susan.
Okay. Our project started in 2005, and it started as a project to try to understand whether oxalate had any relevance to autism or not. We totally didn't know whether reducing oxalate would improve their lot, and we needed to find that out. And so I spent about 4 months studying the literature on oxalate, and in that I also looked at all the lists that were out there, and I found out what the scientists had been chasing and what they had not been chasing. And so when I went to about 7 different oxalate conferences, I learned that the people who were the movers and the shakers in the field were not interested in the diet. And that was a huge shock, because they definitely knew, about a connection between oxalate and kidney stones, but they were all kidney doctors. And so they thought only kidney people would be affected by this. And so it totally made no sense to them that it could have something to do with kids with autism unless they had kidney stones. So we had a whole lot of different work to do. But part of it was to try to figure out, well, does this have any relevance to improving, how the kids do? And so that's why I set out to try to figure out, what information was out there on the levels of this and that. And the Vulvar Pain Foundation already had this wonderful cookbook that had, values, specific values for different amounts. But a lot of the places that we checked, they didn't. All they would say is high, medium, or low. And then when I talked to people who had kidney stones and had been to their doctor, the doctor would give them a sheet of paper and said, these are some low foods and these are some high foods. And it was a 1-page sheet of paper. And absolutely every one of them said to me, when I followed the sheet, I did not get rid of my kidney stones. Okay. And so then I thought, well, gosh, it looks like the people that have kidney stones also need the same information, just like the information that I need for autism. And so that's kind of how the project started and got bigger and expanded. And a lot of the work that I did for the previous 10 years was all about oxalate and where it would go, because I had studied sulfate and where it would go. And then we knew that the two were combined. So that's why it became important to get good values, and also recognizing that, oh my gosh, why don't they agree? And so one of the people, the person that really initiated the putting together of the spreadsheet was Carla, and she copied all the data out of the Vulvar Pain Foundation book, and she started getting other sources and figuring out how to organize it and all of that sort of thing. And so I will maybe pass on to her to tell you more how it got put together and how you use it.
Well, I decided to try to consolidate what we had on the data that we had on the Yahoo group, plus the low oxalate cookbook, because as a parent who was putting my kid through the diet, along with doing it myself, it was very frustrating to not have specific information. The stuff that was out there was, like Susan said, a list. This is high, this is low, this is medium, without really understanding that there's some variability there. Cantaloupe is low, but it's at the very high end of low. So if you have more than a half cup, you've now had something that's medium oxalate. Whereas grapes are fairly low, and you could probably have cup and a half of that and still stay low. So there were some big differences, and my son wasn't progressing as much as I thought he could be. When I actually started, running the numbers from the spreadsheet, after creating the spreadsheet and running the numbers with the recipes, all of a sudden, my kid started really making good progress. I mean, he was still dumping, but, the change is just by knowing, I have to limit him to a half cup of this, but I can go a little more with that. Maybe I can't use, a teaspoon of this herb or this spice, but hey, this is a low oxalate, a good low oxalate substitute like nutmeg. Nutmeg is medium per teaspoon. Mace, which is basically from the same plant as nutmeg, is extremely low. So it really helped me, produce recipes that I loved and that the family loved. So we didn't have to really sacrifice, good eating and, still good nutrition. And we could still stay, within that 40 to 60 range that we were looking for.
And
So,
can I just jump in? Because I think one of the things that gets people really confused is that we rate food. It looks like we rate a food to them. But what we really have is a rating on an amount of oxalate. So we have a rating that says if the oxalate's between 0 and I think just under 2, that's very low, or it's just under 1, that's very low. Then we have low, then we have medium, but those ratings are accompanied not by a food, but by an amount of oxalate. So it's the amount of oxalate in your serving size, which we are actually essentially rating, right? Because this is where that big confusion comes in. How can broccoli be low, medium, and high on the spreadsheet? Just as an example. Well, if you have a half a cup of boiled broccoli, it's going to be low, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. If you have a half a cup of steamed broccoli where you've kind of wilted the broccoli, taking some of the water out so you get more in that half cup of the actual broccoli, then you're medium. Of course, you eat a whole cup of it and maybe you've tipped over the threshold where we say something is high, which is 15 milligrams. So I think part of the confusion here is that people think that you can just rate a food. But in effect, what the ratings were designed to help people do is stay within a certain oxalate threshold. And that's a different ball game than rating a food. And I suspect food ratings for other kinds of diets have kind of thrown us all off here, in the sense that really, push come to shove, my ability to eat a particular food is going to depend a lot on the amount of oxalate that's in the final serving that goes on my plate. So if I'm willing to sit down and eat like a big steak, but half a cup of steamed broccoli, that may give me exactly the same oxalate as like a half a cup of bok choy stems and a half a cup of grapes and a half a cup. Like I could maybe eat 4 or 5 different servings of 4 or 5 different foods and get the same oxalate level. So we have to start to have a little bit more nuance in how we're thinking about this, and realize that even if our data is not beautifully, perfectly accurate, it's how we bias our diet. So we're trying to bias in a direction that's lower oxalate. It's not going to be perfect for a bunch of reasons that my fellow wizards here are going to talk about as well, but particularly growing conditions. And so I'm going to hand off to Patricia and let her have some fun with that.
Yeah, no, growing conditions do, but just finishing what you were saying, how we're measuring the amount of oxalate in a particular serving. You also have to remember that it's everything that you're eating, throughout the day, that's going to be your total oxalate consumption. So if you decide to have the steamed broccoli at lunch, you might want to go a little lower, and your choices might be a little lower at dinner, and then everything would even out. And the other thing that is really important is things that are high, you don't necessarily use in a high amount. And a perfect example would be something like cinnamon. So cinnamon is extremely high per half cup, but I would like to see who's brave enough to eat a half cup of cinnamon. People just will not do that. So because cinnamon, you just take like a little spray on something, and that's more than enough. So that's, I think those are some really clear examples to give you that notion that we're talking about oxalate in an amount, and then you play with that amount, and it's not necessarily classifying a food. And now on the growing conditions, it's, I think my connection's unstable again, sorry. But
Yes.
on the growing conditions, many things are, or if not, I can go and get my cable and try to connect via cable if you want to keep talking about something
Well,
else.
I can talk about the like an apple, just thinking about an apple or something else. When you say an apple, you don't know which variety you're talking about. And so one of the things we found through testing was that not all apple varieties have the same density of oxalate in them. So this apple might be okay, and this other apple may not be as much okay, or whatever. And so when I went to my I think it was about my third oxalate conference, there was a poster on kiwi fruit, and they were looking at something like 60 different varieties of kiwi fruit. And what they found is it wasn't even in the same place of the fruit. Like some of them were high in the skin, around the skin area. And it's kind of hard to call a kiwi with the skin, but it didn't matter where it was. You couldn't make a hard and fast root that if you get rid of the skin, you won't get so much oxalate, because the oxalate was kind of moving around depending on the variety. And so this is why we can't be more accurate than life. It's like the real existence of these plants is going to influence how much oxalate they have. And that's very built on the species, but then also very important is the growing conditions. So we know things like how much water it gets, how many dark days to light days, how much rain, just all of those things impinge on how much oxalate a particular plant will have. And most of the oxalate we're getting is from plant food, because there's practically none in most animal products.
And that's going to vary from location to location. One of the things that the VP Foundation had tested was, I believe it was rosemary. And they tested it from 2 different states. And one was Massachusetts and the other was South Carolina. And actually same brand, but grown in different, different locations and 2 completely different levels. So it's just not going to be hard and fast. And we don't really have specific information on varieties. When you go to a grocery store, and you get, let's say, I'll say zucchini as an example. Bush zucchini is the one that's commonly there, but there's at least 10 different subvarieties that some look, pretty close to being exactly the same. Some look different, but when you go into the store, it doesn't tell you, is this a jade bush zucchini or another variety of bush zucchini?
Well,
So
one of the things you can know is, that if it's grown on the other side of the planet, that probably is because it's in the opposite season, and where you live, you can't grow it right then, but you can get it from someplace that has a different growing season. And so all of our food now, we have very little information about how it was grown, or even things like which fertilizer did they use. And even fertilizer can change the amount of oxalate in a food. Yes. Although you're kind of cut up.
Not only cable, I am so sorry. but it's not even the type of fertilizer or herbicide, whatever that they're using. It's also what kind of life is in the soil, because
Yep.
how the carbon, and that's sugar based. And the plant is not only sugar to live. So there is this exchange between the biome, the microbiome, soil, and what the plant is using via the carbon from, and or what's happening with the, and depending on what varieties and what quantities you have, fungi and the different soil, that is going to extremely affect, how nutritious. Just it's really a whole change. Really that present in the comes up into the plant in a bioavailable form. And that's why it's so important when you're growing in like an organic or biodynamic thing, to focus on the life on the soil, because all the minerals are there. So you don't really need to add more minerals. You need to add more life. And that's not only seeds from pepper.
I'm so sorry we're having technical problems with getting from Belgium, is where Patricia lives.
We may need to have Patricia do this on another time when her
Right.
situation is more happily set up, because I think it's an important discussion that really brings home the point, which I was sort of alluding to earlier, which is that we need to bias in the direction of a lower oxalate intake, but we're not going to be able to do this perfectly. At best, we're going to be able to manage to the, kind of to the best of our ability, but we're not necessarily going to be able to do this with the degree of precision that some of us may prefer. So I'll say I often use an average of our data points. That's a way that I cope with the fact that our data may not be always completely predictable for, the particular kind of rosemary that I've got in the spice bottle that I bought, right? So I take the multiple dried rosemary data points on our spreadsheet. I go to the dreaded column right after the name of the food, which is oxalate per 100 grams. I'll take as many different values there as we've got, like different test values. I'll add them up. I'll divide by the number of test values I had. I'll get an amount per gram, and then I will multiply my serving in grams by the amount of oxalate per gram. So that's one way that I tend to try to reduce error, either too low or too high for a food. Because honestly, in many other areas, we have averages. So a great example is if you sit down and eat an apple today and you eat another apple tomorrow, the number of calories that are in that apple will not be the same. Right? We have a similar thing that you have with oxalate. Depending upon growing conditions, you could have a different amount of sugar, you could have a different amount of calories in your food, but we have averages. And at this point, we do not have the many thousands of test values that would give us really solid averages, but we can use the data that we've got to give ourselves the best bias that we can, knowing that, occasionally something may have a lot more oxalate than we think. Occasionally something may have a lot less oxalate than we think. And it'll work out in the wash overall, because some of the areas where we do have multiple data points, you can see things starting to cluster in a particular place. And that may, start to give us some better ways to deal with the diet over time. But, obviously being able to test everything in the world many times is going to take a lot of time before we get there. Yeah, Patricia, go ahead. Oh, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
I am so sorry that it's not working well, but the other thing is that you should not also just assume that a category of food is going to have the same level. So green peppers are higher than red peppers, even though it looks like the same plant. And in some instances, it can be a huge difference. We were talking in the testing about testing some mushrooms, because some mushrooms are very low. And I had made that mistake. I just saw mushrooms as something that I could feel very comfortable eating, until I found at a friend's home that she had some coffee with chaga. And I said, "What is that?" And she said, "It's a mushroom." So I said, "Give me some." Boy, bad idea. And then I found out that it was nephrotoxic. I mean, this thing is so incredibly high in oxalates. So that is just a word to the wise. Do not assume.
A really great point, because I've told this story on the trying low oxalates group before, but because the data on green beans had some variety to it, we kind of decided that one summer when I planted green beans that, oh, well, these will probably be okay. It was a very bad decision. So yeah, you can't just assume that just because you've got some kind of food that looks okay, that every kind of that same plant will look okay. There's great variation in green beans. So anybody out there listening, do not do what we did. Like, treat them with respect. We do have a few kinds of beans that we've tested where they're okay, but those green ones, nope.
Well, it's pretty expensive to test it, and that's why we have a testing group. And people can certainly, if you have a particular food that's not tested that you want tested, you certainly need to become part of that group and let it be known, what it is that you want tested.
Yeah.
But years ago, I was working with a professor at an agriculture school. And he and I applied for a grant to try to, use the same seed and grow it under different conditions, and then measure the oxalate level and that sort of thing, because there's just not enough data out there on this sort of thing. And one of our purposes was to maybe identify, hey, if you're going to grow tomatoes, we'll use this seed. If you're going to grow eggplant, grow this seed, although eggplant's pretty high. But you know what I'm saying. Just there may be varieties of some of these things that are not that bad. And like, one of the things that I really wanted to do is to take advantage of people. I think it's in Peru, where they have like hundreds and hundreds of varieties of potatoes. Well, maybe there's some that aren't that bad. And wouldn't it be great if we could advocate for the development of a low oxalate potato that was great and tasted wonderful, and you could do all sorts of wonderful things with it? And so this is the point of what we're doing, is to try to get it to where our quality of life is better, because we can make better choices.
Well, and kale's another example like that. Some forms of kale are quite high, but then we did all that testing and we found lacinato kale and we found purple kale. And son of a gun if those weren't a lot lower than kind of the traditional curly kale. So I think if we can, help to influence how plants are bred so that we get ones that are by their nature less likely to be using oxalate in a way that's toxic for us, then that's, that is a great place for us to go. And my kids have been asking me to get the King Edward potatoes so that they can have potatoes and not have to worry about their serving size. So that's another example. Patricia.
I was just going to finish up a little bit of what Susan was saying about the testing. A lot of the people, I work with a lot of Spanish speaking people trying to do the lowering of oxalates. And a lot of the people ask me, why are there so many American foods, some commercial industrial foods? So here I would say it's because somebody said, I need this is interesting for me, I'm going to pay for the testing. But in that spirit of cooperation and having things available to as many people as possible, it might be interesting for you to know that it's more interesting to test an ingredient than a product with ingredients. So if we can have those funds to test the different mushrooms and the different this and the different that, it's useful for the entire world, whether we go to Nabisco's quick whatever biscuit or whatever frozen juice or something like that that is only available in one market. And then that information, it's useful to that particular market and to that particular person, of course, but then it's not available for anybody else.
Yeah, and I can speak to that because as the one who's been coordinating test batches now for a couple of years, what I've really been trying to do each time we have a batch is have Monique's special project, whatever it is. And so one time I was coordinating our members who were willing to send in dried legumes and have them tested dry. Why? Because we use them as ingredients in dishes where we just want to throw them in. We don't want to cook them first and then put them in. And so, there's been some effort and some thought going in the background. Where do we need to cover more ground? But for sure, anybody who wants to be part of our initiatives to really test ingredients, because as Patricia rightly pointed out, we don't need more processed products. What we need are the good whole food ingredients that you can cook yourself, because that's also going to be the most nutritious for your family. So the more of those ingredients we can cover and the more test values we can get of them, the better off we'll all be in terms of how we can manage our diet. And that's something that I've been volunteering my time towards as a special project, just in general, because I think it makes such a difference for all of us.
Well, one of the issues is also expense. I mean, there are, especially when it comes to produce, there is produce that you can get, in Italy, in Spain, in Belgium, in Australia, in the Far East that you can't get here. And the cost to ship it here, because the testing is done here in the States, it's just expensive. One of the things that I was doing was, if someone had mentioned, I wish we could get this product tested, and it's in, I'm from Australia, and I managed to find the product on Amazon, then I would send that in, because it was cheaper for me to purchase it from Amazon and just have it shipped to the lab than someone actually sending it from Australia or Japan, and because they're not only paying to get the product tested, but they're paying a pretty huge amount to get the product shipped. And when it's produce, you know, all bets are off if you can actually get it, you know, something shipped fresh from overseas, you know, to the lab and still have it be, you know, fresh enough to test.
And I also want to throw out that our group is in at least 127 countries. That's just like you know, imagine all the different language groups that represents. And so if you live somewhere and it's not in the US or it's not in Canada or Belgium, please think about looking in your native language to see if there are any experts in oxalate who do work in your language group, because they may have actually tested a lot of those foods, and then we can learn from there if there are certain lower oxalate foods that might be great for the rest of us. But if we've never heard of them, we're not going to test it.
Yeah,
So-
and that's actually a great lead into the fact that I've learned all sorts of common terminology for foods I didn't know before. So if you're using our spreadsheet and you eat swede, that's rutabaga. If you're using our spreadsheet and you eat capsicum, that's sweet bell peppers, and that could be red peppers, green peppers. So to some extent, we're also trying to put together a document that can be used by people who use different terminology for foods. But we need to know when what's on the spreadsheet isn't the word that you use, we might want to hear from you so that we can start to ensure that we cover this. Because when people are trying to use our document and they're brain fogged, we know that's challenging. So, you know, we might be looking for even a little bit of editorial feedback from time to time. So maybe how we've got the name split up doesn't work for you. Maybe sweet bell pepper has to be all in a row as opposed to sweet comma bell comma, or whatever we've got, because in some cases, you know, we're doing the best we can with how we understand it. But if you're having a problem finding something, we want to make that work better. So just know that there are things like capsicum, which are bell peppers. There are things like swedes, which are rutabagas. And although not too many people have this challenge, I had somebody ask me about yellow turnip. That, folks, is a rutabaga. And where I come from in Southern Ontario, we talk about yellow turnips. So sometimes you have different language, even in a place where you wouldn't expect, like in Canada, we might have terms that they're not using in the US. So it's not that even all of us who might be coming from English speaking countries are necessarily using the same terms.
So what we need is what we're saying, and this is us pleading to you, because if you are using the spreadsheet and go, oh my gosh, I don't see what I eat, and you know, I grew up on A, B, C, D, and none of those things are in the spreadsheet, well, let us know, because we don't know, you know, where we're missing some territory unless you tell us. So please don't feel like you can't do that and that you would be presuming upon us, because we want to make our spreadsheet as valuable to the whole world as we can.
And with that said, we're also working on the categories. So one of the things which is coming up, which will be our next revision after our next batch of testing, is a look at those categories and how we can make them more useful to you, even in the stages where you're reducing, where you're trying to come down at a level at a time. And so we do have a new rollout, which will be happening in the new year, which will include sort of a traffic light kind of approach where we've got colors assigned to different levels, and a way again just to allow you to be able to look for the stuff that applies to you at this point. And you may not be eating a fully low oxalate diet yet. You may not be in that 40 to 60 range. And if you're not, we want to be able to help you back down from higher levels to lower levels, perhaps in another approach that might be a little simpler than what you're doing now. And this color coding, the idea there is to try and help you to do that without having to necessarily have to do every calculation. We don't want to dissuade you from tracking by numbers, because personally, I think it makes a lot of sense, but we also don't want to make everybody crazy while they're trying to do this process. So we want to allow for a variety of ways to come into the spreadsheet and access what you need.
And actually be able to tie that back to recipes.
Oh yes, and be able to tie that back to recipes, which you know, do you want to talk a little bit about that, Carla? Because you and I were the ones who cooked up some of this.
Well, when we were working on the color coding, you know, you came up with the great idea. Our recipes, you know, that we have, we could very easily tie in. So, you know, if you're, you know, at let's say 150, and we have a specific color code for, you know, 100 to 150 milligrams a day, you know, we could create and have recipes that tie into that specific level. So when you're starting out or working your way down, what the heck am I going to eat? You know, all the recipes I see are like 5 milligrams or less. You know, that's not going to help me get there. Well, hey, here's one that's 25 milligrams per serving. You know, is it going to be something that I'm going to eat? No. But, you know, the friend of mine that's working her way down, yeah, you know, that might work for her. And, you know, the whole goal is to make it easier for you to work your way down, you know, to where you're not, you know, pulling your hair out trying to figure out what you're going to eat and how to constantly adjust up, especially when you're starting out, because, you know, you may not be feeling all that great, you know, in the first place. So if we can, you know, if I can make it easier for you to work your way down and avoid some of the troubles that I went to, I will gladly do that.
And what we really have too is to think about meal budgets. So if we're saying that for a particular meal, maybe you're trying to hit 200 milligrams of oxalate, because maybe you're at 700 a day or something. And then if we've got these color codes, again, you'll be able to say, okay, look, if I pick a 100 milligram main dish and a 50 milligram side dish and another 50 milligram side dish, there I am at my 200, right? So again, the idea is to make some of this simple and also give you some kind of building blocks like Lego that you can fit in between and be able to do that without necessarily having to be a math whiz. Susan, you were going to jump in. Yeah.
I would like to make a suggestion too. I mean, our spreadsheet is ginormous, would be the word that I would use for it. How many items do we have now, ladies?
Over
About
3,000.
4,000 lines, isn't it?
It's over
Okay.
3,000.
Yeah.
Like 3,600.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's big. And a lot of people are just intimidated by that, and rightfully so. And so if you don't eat roasted aardvark, and that's on our list, you don't need to be carrying around to the grocery store a list that has aardvark on there. Okay. So what I do, and I suggest this to anybody, is that if you know how to use Excel, then when you first get the gigantic spreadsheet, then make another column off to the left. And on that column, mark, do we that, I mean, you can make your own code, whatever you want to, you know, yes, no, do eat, don't eat. I mean, you can just code it however you want to, how many categories you want to, but you might consider foods I might think about eating and foods that that I do eat and things that would be lower that I want to start eating. You know, you just like figure out your categories and then mark them and go down and then skip all the other ones, like don't mark them, and then sort the whole thing so that you only get the ones that you're interested in. And then you don't have an enormous spreadsheet that you're carrying around with you. And then that can be your customized spreadsheet that just you use.
And we
Does that
do
make
have
sense?
a tutorial that shows you how, if you don't, let's say, want to delete stuff, but you just don't want to see it, you can hide it. If you're not, there are some people who really aren't interested in the numbers. They just want to eat, I'm only going to eat stuff that's very low to medium, and that's it. So I don't care what the high, extremely high, and very high stuff is. Well, there's a way to hide those columns. So you're not seeing the data that you don't want and the foods that you don't want. And you can, there is a tutorial that shows you how to hide those rows and columns that you're not interested in looking at.
I can put that in the notes for this session so that anybody who catches this session, we can point them to the one where they can learn more about how to handle the spreadsheet.
I also want to put out one more thing about weight versus volume and how that is useful to you. If you can get yourself a scale at your house so that that's a gram scale, and so that you get your food and you see how much it weighs, and then you can use that number and you can use the column over there that's the 100 grams has this much, okay? That's if you're weighing it, then you want to use that. But if it's a volume thing, like they say a cup of this or a cup of that. Now I will tell you that my cup of strawberries might not be the same as your cup of strawberries, because maybe I like to chop it really tiny and so I smush a whole lot in there. Or else it's something like arugula that, how do you know how densely you're packing it into that cup? So there's certain foods that it makes much more sense to use the weight thing than it does the volume thing. And so that's one reason we have it expressed both ways, because depending on what you're doing, you need that information one way or the other way.
That said, don't make yourself crazy. I
Yeah.
started, many of us started, I was one of them. My brain would not function. And so I started with cups, and I only got fancy with weights and stuff later on when I felt like I could, deal with that extra bit of information. So for those of us who are used to weights, beautiful. Most European recipes use weights for ingredients. A lot of Australian ones do too. Please don't feel you have to go to measuring cups. But for those of us who are familiar with your regular ordinary 2-cup or 1-cup measuring cup in North America, if you want to take that and put your broccoli in it and then decide what your serving size looks like, it's about biasing your diet in the right direction. Any positive changes you're making are better than none. But I don't want us to miss the question about uncalc. We need to talk about what uncalc means on the spreadsheet, because we are confusing the daylights out of people with uncalc.
Well, it simply means that the data that's been provided that helps us calculate oxalate per serving in the recipe hasn't been provided. It's all based on a specific formula. And a lot of the times, especially in the studies, you get oxalate per 100 grams and that's it. And yeah, we could probably take some of those items and, okay, this is a 1/2 cup, this is how much it weighs, and figure it out. But then, there are many items that I can't find. And since I can't find it, I can't input information that I don't have. So that's the reason.
And it's not any more complicated than weighing and measuring. So we have tried dragon fruit. I remember when you got this data, Carla, from a study where dragon fruit came out as like about 8.5 milligrams for about 100 grams of fruit. And I went, ooh, so a 50-gram serving will be just about right. And so we actually have tried dragon fruit. Turns out that it was really lovely. It has kind of a light citrusy note, a little bit of a crunchy seed in there. It was a lot of fun. And so while it is an uncalc food, and if you're new to our group, you may want to avoid uncalc foods because you're just not feeling up to it. But at the point when you get that you might feel up to it, just give yourself the opportunity to try and fail, and maybe it doesn't quite work out the way you expect, but just measure out some servings and see what you find that might be a new food, that's some more variety in your diet. I live near the city of Toronto, so we have lots of Asian and what they call international markets around here that bring in food from all over. So I have the wonderful privilege of being able to go and buy all kinds of interesting things. And so we've tried many things and discovered new favorites, and dragon fruit was one of them.
Well, and I just want to add to that, that I live in Dallas and we have a lot of internationals here, and they have their own grocery stores. And I found out by asking that there are people that grow the food that is, more normal on the other side of the planet, but they want to eat it here. So there are people that grow it here. So you don't have to go send it off to, Asia or someplace like that to try to get a fresh food on that score. So if you live in a big enough community, check out some of your international grocery stores.
Yeah, I would second that. I would definitely second that. There's some fun to be had if you're a foodie. We've tried jackfruit. We've tried all kinds of things. We can only get jackfruit canned, but that turns out to be okay from an oxalate standpoint. It's a little more medium, but yeah. So there's lots of interesting things that we're trying to add to the spreadsheet so that people's options get bigger, not smaller.
It's really easy for all of us to get in a rut because, you don't have to think so hard when you're in a rut. But if you're trying to figure out, well, how can I make this diet not so boring? Then that's when you need to be a little bit more creative about how to use the spreadsheet and let it be your entry into a more diversified life, shall we say.
Yeah, that's a great
And
point.
if you're a foodie, one thing I would also recommend is getting something like a food substitutions Bible. I
Do you
have
have a
one.
good one?
What was that?
You have a good one that you would recommend?
Hang on just a second.
You look like you were.
Looking for it. What was it?
Oh, and while Carla's looking for that, oh, lovely.
Oh, wonderful. Who made that?
By
Carla.
David Joachim.
Okay, it looks huge.
And I pretty much lived with this for the first couple years because, can't use this. Well, what can I substitute? What can I substitute for spinach and chard? And for spices, especially, this was a godsend. So, sometimes you can have, a good meal, and you can find substitutes that are lower in oxalate. So this was a huge help for me.
Oh, and there are some great substitutions too. My background is Swiss. There's something called Rösti, which is made with potatoes, and I swear it's a Swiss national food. I always called it walking up the mountain food because it's just really calorie dense and potatoes and stuff. And my grandmother made it by a layer of potatoes. I substituted cauliflower, a layer of thinly sliced ham. I went, okay, I can live with that. But then she would put spinach, and I went, no, I can't do spinach. And what I ended up finding out just by chance was that radish greens, which are, fuzzy, funny texture, not appealing raw, they make the best tasting sub for steamed spinach, even better than arugula. Like awesome. And so, sometimes even a little bit of experimentation can be kind of fun too.
And I don't know if this applies to anybody else, but my husband retired this last year, and he's turning into a foodie. And so he's getting interested in exploring different foods and different recipes and things like that. And so if you are so brain fogged that you look at all this stuff and go, oh, I can't handle it, well, see if your spouse can help you a little bit. Or your child. You may have a child that would be interested in that.
Yeah. Well, my friends, we have managed to round out the hour just about. We have a couple of minutes if anybody who's on live with us here has a question that they want to throw up in the chat. And while we're waiting for that, I'll also say one of my favorite discoveries since going low oxalate was what you can use the plain, ordinary, common red radish for. I had only ever eaten it raw. My family only ever ate them raw. I had no idea anything about cooking them. I planted a row in my garden and my kids hated them raw. And I went, uh-oh, I've got an entire row of this in my garden and nobody else wants to eat it but me. There was no way I was eating like this whole harvest of red radishes raw. Cooked, they turn out to be mild and sweet. They're not hot and spicy at all. It's like a completely different food. So you can use like small amounts in something like maybe a potato and cauliflower salad for a little bit of bite, but then you can use it cooked and still have the benefits of a low oxalate veggie. So just one of those things that I've learned along the way over the last 15 years. We do not seem to have anybody asking any questions at the moment. So
you steam the leaves, or how do you fix the leaves?
When you steam them, that fuzzy, furry taste goes away. They wilt right down and they become this nice, dense sort of mat of green, which is perfect with rösti. So with rösti, it's the potatoes, it's the ham, it's the spinach, and then you put preferably an easy over egg on top. And that's what makes your sauce. So you cut through the egg and the yolk and that all drizzles through your layers. And yeah, it's fun. I think every area in Switzerland, like other countries, has their own version of this thing. So I remember traveling in Switzerland and finding different kinds of rösti across the country. But that was ours. Yeah.
And I just want to remind people that we have a recipe group. And if you have something that is a great food in your country and none of us would know about it, get on that group and talk.
Yes.
Yep, we're all ears. Sorry.
I would say,
No,
and
remember
don't be
that
afraid to post
everybody
recipes.
is at a different level.
And don't be afraid to post recipes that you may need help hacking on. I mean, we do that all the time. We did that all the time on the Yahoo group. That, here's this recipe. Can you help me make it low oxalate or lower oxalate? There are plenty of people on the site that are more than willing to toss out ideas to help you work, make it something that you can still have.
Yeah, and actually I'm doing that all this month on my Patreon channel because people want Christmas recipes. So I'm having fun hacking Christmas recipes this month. So it's a way for us to have the variety that we want and enjoy the taste and the kind of celebratory food that we like. Not that we haven't talked about that lots when we did Thanksgiving. So
And just remember that because it's posted on the recipes book, on the recipes group, that does not mean that that is something that you can eat. Because somebody might be posting a recipe because they are at 2,000 milligrams of oxalate a day and they're going down to 1,800 and you are already at 600. So please remember that it's all about lowering your own oxalate level slowly and surely and very gradually. So just remember, you know, not everybody's in the same place, and just you know, take it with something like the book that Carla was showing us. You know, how can I change this that looks wonderful to my level? And that's a challenge and the fun. And we wish you a very tasteful, lovely, lower oxalate journey.
All right, folks, we're going to wind up for today. Thanks to everybody who came and kept us company here live. And stay tuned. There will be more of Wizards of Ox to come. But for this week, we've had our discussion about food and the spreadsheet, and we hope it's helpful.
And don't forget, if you like what you see, subscribe to our channel, which is low oxalate. So Wizards of Ox, low oxalate experts on YouTube, and the Trying Low Oxalate group on Facebook and Groups.io. Okay.
Thanks, everyone. We will sign off for now.
Bye-bye.